The next speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce Dirk Wallace. Dirk is a senior researcher at the Foundation for Arable Research, and Dirk led the team to do quite a bit of work alongside the vegetable sector around recovery. And Dirk this afternoon is going to be talking to us about one study on the impact on annual cropping. So welcome, Dirk.
Right, afternoon all. Yes, we're going to zoom out a little bit, just wait for my slides to come up, but Dan's done an excellent job of talking through understanding the impact on soil and sediments, and what this study aimed to do was complement that by looking at what was happening at the paddock scale. So that's really the difference. Much like Dan though, I've got to echo that I am just the project manager in the face of this one. All the hard yards were done by Diana Mathers and Alan Cale in the Hawke's Bay, and Elliot Callender and Melanie Bryant up in Tairawhiti. So let's get cracking. So in terms of the impact on annual cropping land, when we turned up, this is essentially what it looked like. So there was either water lying around, crops buried, or forestry on cropping land. And at that point, as a researcher, you're a little bit confused as to what to do. A lot of people were asking us as a sector body for information, and we didn't really have a plan for that. So I think in terms of assessing impact and talking about impact on farm, first we've got to stop and figure out how do we actually figure out what the impact of an event like this has been. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. We took pretty much the analogue approach as an arable sector. We really just called people. The challenge we found when we did call people was that the people we spoke to said they'd been called by 9 other people to ask them the same question. So on farm they definitely knew what had happened, but I think one of the learnings coming out of it was that potentially we can all work better together to ask the same question, and that was some of the feedback from growers we met. They wanted one single conversation, not 10. They're already stressed enough. So personal learning from that is that we need to connect as sectors before we go out and contact, because they all grow everything. They're great people, and they'll have many strands to their businesses. So after we'd connected and assessed, yes, this is a massive challenge. Obviously you want to help. The challenge is no one really knew what to do. No one really knew how to return annual cropping to productive capacity. So we did what any good human does, and you go along and you visit and you have a cup of tea and you listen. And essentially after those conversations, we knew there was limited recovery information out there. We had good recovery information for pasture, limited for cropping, so we knew that was a research gap. But growers identified that they would have loved to know what worked in Bowler for their systems. So they point that out. So we walked away from those conversations thinking, well, what we could actually do is work together to record hindsight and just use that to inform future decisions. So essentially they get on with repairing their land and getting back to business, and we be the nagging person alongside them, just staying in touch and recording what they did. So to initiate that, we focused on the Hawke's Bay and Tairawhiti regions. I will present a little bit of impact outside of that because it's been addressed that this event affected the whole of the North Island, but this project was centred in this area. What we did was we selected 46 different sites, and I think one of the key successful elements to this project was actually that we used local consultants. We didn't go in and try and be a new face. So we used people connected in Tairawhiti and people that were connected to the vegetable and arable industries around Hawke's Bay. And what we tasked them was to look for sites that had a range of impacts and a range of recovery decisions. So to put it simply, our aim was to build case study examples for future growers, and what we wanted to do was understand how different decisions affected outcomes. So we would group sites according to the impact. If they all had the same impact, essentially they're all different businesses, so they make different decisions, and that allowed us to tell different stories essentially to those future growers. So in terms of impacts, there's kind of two sides. There's that qualitative stuff and there's the quantitative stuff. A lot of this project was focused on that qualitative, so I want to start off there and then get into some of the numbers that we've been recording in this study. So first impact is always involves a human, right? And I think this slide describes it well, at least the situation. So under every one of these decisions, there's a human stressed out, trying to do right by their business, and so that element of it also needs to play a role. It needs to be considered, and I think that's one of the most important things to put at the front of the impact. The impact is affecting a person, not just a business. But I'll proceed to talk about the business impacts now. So just wanted to acknowledge that before we get too far in. And I'm actually quite pleased this hasn't been mentioned too much today, but through the North Island there was actually quite a lot of wind damage that occurred. And I'm personally based over in the Waikato, and we had a lot of maize crops go very flat. That was a pretty stressful event for a lot of growers, but it was recoverable. A lot of the contractors were able to harvest those crops, and a lot of them were destined for the silage market anyway. It did slow down harvest, it still had an impact, it just wasn't as widely discussed. Interestingly, we did actually have quite a few on-farm research trials where we were looking at different tillage practices. And what we've found, anecdotally, is that some of our no-till established maize was actually stronger, was able to stand up to those winds and didn't get lodged. Now, there's a myriad of factors as to why that might have been. In no-till, you tend to get lower populations, so you might have thicker stems. But it's a nice outcome to come away from understanding there's an impact, but potentially there's a learning there for the future and wind damage too. The next big one was water. So I'm going to classify water in two groups. One was the fast-moving water. That could also flatten crops really well. Wasn't so recoverable. And the other thing, as we've seen, is many onions kind of floating down riverways, so it removed crops. The other kind of water was the slow-moving water that Dan discussed before, where you set up these impromptu ponds or lakes. A lot of challenges, and one of the main impacts of this is that you just can't get on to do anything. You've just got to sit there and watch it drain, which can be, as a human dealing with it, really deflating. There was also quite a lot of uncertainty around food safety and harvestability of some of those crops once the water drained. And I should have mentioned, it did also remove crops. It essentially melted them. So that's a factor with that one too. So once we got through the impact of water, we found sediment overlying the land, essentially. And what we found from these studies was really two drivers on the impact on that business. One was the kind of texture you got, so whether you got a sandy sediment or a siltier sediment, and the other was the depth. And those two factors really controlled your options moving forward. Obviously, deeper, heavier sediments had a greater impact than light, shallow sediments. Essentially, some of those systems, you're starting with a new farm. Now, in terms of that impact on growers themselves, for many it wasn't actually new. They knew they were farming on a floodplain and they'd been through historic events. This is actually a pit dig from Wairoa, where Alan Cale and the grower were able to go through and actually identify where the previous flood events had been. So you can actually see that stratification of built-up soil. The thing that was different with this event was the amount of sediment and the timing. So it came through right before they were close to harvest, buried the crops, and essentially turned their cash flow sheet into a big zero. That makes it incredibly stressful. If there's no income, you've got less options in terms of recovery. So alongside the sediment, Dan touched on it before, if you're getting more than 20 centimetres, you're essentially farming new land. It's a little bit of a repetition of some of those numbers that Dan presented, but still good to talk about. This is from up around Tolaga Bay, and these are the numbers that this property had before the flood and then after the flood. So as you can see, pH going from 6.1 to 7.6 makes it really challenging in terms of access to nutrients for any subsequent plant. And sulfate like Dan said, sulfate S going through the roof from less than 4 to 27. So it's a whole new world when it comes to farming, which can be stressful for those doing this as well. Alongside changes in what's in the soil or what's in your new soil, a lot of growers ended up with forestry blocks on their land. That's not really useful if you're trying to grow annual crops. So the first challenge was actually to get rid of that stuff. And for some growers, that took up to 9 months to remove the forestry slash. In terms of what options were available, it depended where you were. So some catchments had rules that you could burn that product. It depended how much capital your business had. Some growers are actually able to purchase forestry mulches and things like that to get through the job easier. And it depended what the collaboration within the catchment was. So we had some growers actually work really well with forestry companies, and the forestry companies sent people or gear or something like that to help remove that unwanted wood, essentially. But huge annoyance, and definitely you could see the stress on the faces of the people that have gone from being maize growers to professional digger drivers. So now we get into the more quantitative stuff. These are some of the numbers that we've collected from those sites in terms of the got stuck on my tongue. Economic impact of crop loss. And hopefully you can see this. It's quite kind of hard. You've got to twist your head and do a little bit of this. But these are individual blocks in the Gisborne region. And this is the value of lost crop from those blocks. So you can see that some are up in that $350,000 mark. That's just the value of crop loss from one block. Each business would have multiple blocks, and this doesn't account for the cost of establishing those crops either. So the losses were significant, well into the millions for many businesses. Once they wanted to get back into cropping, they also found there was additional challenges in terms of the economics. More passes were required to establish a seedbed you could plant into. And so these numbers range depending on where you were and what kind of sediment you were receiving. And Pakawhai and Wairoa on some of those heavier sediments, and particularly where vegetables were being established, up to 11 passes were used to turn the ground into something plantable. There's also challenges around block drains and different fertilisers required, different herbicides required that were tackling new and challenging weeds and new and challenging problems. And one of the final impacts around economics that I wanted to point out is actually just getting onto your farm. So it's kind of like running a business and the doors are locked for 17 months. It's kind of hard to make money, right? So we saw a range of impact from access, and it really just echoes the points of other speakers in that it's one of my favourite quotes, that farming's like running a factory without a roof. It's not just the impact of the sediment, it's what happens afterwards, and it's the season you get when it comes time to plant. And as you can see, these are weather information from two different locations, Pakawhai around here and Wairoa. November is typically time when you're planting your annual crops. In Wairoa, they had 350 millimetres of rainfall. So crops just couldn't get planted. They had to miss a productive season, which has a huge flow-on economic impact. So what does this really all mean? Well, I guess the main impacts that we assessed were from one of those three: wind, water and sediment deposition, and often a combination of all three. Debris was really an additional headache and an additional hurdle that a lot of growers had to get through. And we saw that the economic impact itself it ranged and it depended on the business. Some were able to get crops in prior to the cyclone coming through, but for some it was a complete crop loss, and that was extremely significant. And I guess the final point is just to reiterate that these impacts aren't experienced in isolation. We can tease them out as researchers, but it's really the compounding stuff that needs to be considered. And yeah, it's been great to listen to the other talks today to try to consolidate some of that thinking. Thank you.